The person who seems incapable of love is often the person most terrified by it. Not because love feels bad to them, but because love, historically, has meant pain, has meant loss, has meant the revelation of a self they were told, directly or indirectly, was not worthy of being loved. Now, and I want to be very precise here, understanding this does not mean excusing the behavior. It does not mean the harm they caused was acceptable. It does not mean you were wrong to leave, or wrong to grieve, or wrong to feel the full weight of what they put you through. Explanation is not absolution, but explanation is the beginning of clarity. Because when you understand what's actually driving the heartlessness, when you see the wound behind the wall, you stop asking the question that has been quietly destroying you. What's wrong with me? Nothing is wrong with you. You encountered someone whose capacity for intimacy was shattered long before you arrived, and that changes everything. Now that we understand the paradox that the narcissist's coldness is a performance built over a wound, the next question becomes almost inevitable. If they can feel, if the emotional capacity is somewhere inside them, then why can't they simply love? Why can't they do what the rest of us, imperfectly and messily, manage to do? Why does intimacy, the very thing every human being is wired to seek, become the thing they most aggressively avoid? The answer lies in the body before it lives in the mind. John Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, spent decades demonstrating something that sounds simple but carries enormous weight. The way we are loved in our earliest years becomes the template through which we experience all love afterward. Not a guideline, not a preference. A template hardwired into the nervous system, operating below the level of conscious choice. And for the child who grows up in an environment where love is inconsistent, conditional, or weaponized, that template becomes a map that leads every single time directly into danger. Think about what that means for a moment. If every time you opened yourself emotionally as a child, every time you reached out, needed comfort, showed weakness, you were met with rejection, ridicule, or simply absence, your nervous system does not conclude that this particular person failed you. It concludes that vulnerability itself is the problem, that needing is the mistake, that love, by its very nature, is a trap. And so the narcissistic adaptation forms not out of selfishness, but out of a kind of ruthless self-preservation. The child and later the adult learns to foreclose on the very emotional channels that would make genuine connection possible. They learn to perform confidence instead of feeling it, to perform indifference instead of processing pain, to construct a self so apparently self-sufficient that no one, including themselves, can see how desperately that original child still wants to be held. Gabor writes that trauma is not what happens to you, it is what happens inside you as a result of what happened to you. And this distinction matters enormously when we look at the narcissist's inability to love in the conventional sense. Because the event itself, the neglect, the conditional approval, the emotional abandonment, is in the past. But what happened inside, the severing of the connection between need and safety, between vulnerability and comfort that lives on, that gets carried into every relationship, activated by every moment of closeness, and most acutely, most painfully, by love. Because love, real love, requires you to be seen. And being seen is precisely what the narcissist's entire psychological architecture is designed to prevent. This is why the closer you got to them, the more erratic their behavior became. This is why the moments of genuine intimacy, the quiet evenings, the unguarded conversations, the times they almost let you in, were so reliably followed by withdrawal, cruelty, or chaos. They did not pull away because they didn't care. They pulled away because something in the body said, "This is where you get hurt." And the nervous system, loyal to its oldest instructions, chose protection over connection every single time. So when someone asks, "Why can't they just love me the way I love them?" the most honest answer is not that they won't. It is that the part of them capable of doing so was quietly buried a very long time ago, and they don't even know where they put it. So we have established two things. First, that the narcissist's emotional coldness is not the absence of feeling, it is the armor built around feeling that became too dangerous to express. And second, that this armor was forged in early experiences where love and pain arrived together, so consistently and so completely, that the nervous system eventually stopped distinguishing between the two. These are not small revelations. They reshape the entire way we interpret narcissistic behavior. And now, we arrive at what many Researchers, clinicians, and survivors, once they have done the work of honest reflection, identify as the single most telling sign. Not the grand gestures, not the love bombing, not even the moments of unexpected tenderness that confused you so completely. The number one sign that a narcissist is secretly, undeniably, emotionally invested in you is something far more primal than any of those. It is jealousy, but not ordinary jealousy. What we are talking about is a disproportionate, almost volcanic reaction to the possibility, not even the reality, the mere possibility that your attention, your affection, or your time might be directed towards someone else. And what makes this particular signal so diagnostically significant is the contrast it creates. Here is a person who has maintained, sometimes for months or years, a posture of emotional indifference toward you, who has withheld affection with surgical precision, who has made you feel, on more occasions than you can count, that your presence in their life was entirely optional. And then someone else shows interest in you, or you mention a friend they don't know, or you simply seem lighter, happier, less focused on them, and something shifts. The mask, that carefully maintained construction of indifference, develops a crack. Suddenly there are questions, accusations, a coldness that transforms into intensity. Attention that was withheld for weeks arrives all at once, urgent and consuming. And you find yourself confused, almost dizzy, because the person standing in front of you now does not match the person who made you feel invisible yesterday. What you are witnessing in that moment is the truth breaking through the performance. The psychological mechanism beneath this is well documented. Narcissists, despite their performed self-sufficiency, are profoundly dependent on what Heinz Kohut called narcissistic supply, the external validation, attention, and emotional energy of specific people who have come to represent something significant to them. And when that supply is threatened, when the source of that regulation appears to be withdrawing or redirecting, the panic that surfaces is not about ego alone. It is about attachment, raw, unprocessed, deeply human attachment wearing the costume of control and possessiveness because it has no other language available to it. This is why their jealousy feels so disconnected from their affection. Because in a healthy emotional system, jealousy and love exist on the same continuum. They are recognized, named, and communicated. But in the narcissistic system, love has been disowned. It has been locked away as weakness. So when the feeling surfaces, and it does surface, because they are human, and you matter to them, it does not come out as vulnerability. It comes out as dominance, as surveillance, as the sudden, suffocating need to reestablish possession over someone they spent considerable energy pretending not to need. That is not cruelty for its own sake. That is a person terrified of losing something they have never learned to properly hold. Jealousy, in the narcissist, is love with nowhere safe to land. By now, a picture is beginning to form. Not the picture most people carry of the narcissist, the cartoon villain, the deliberate manipulator gleefully pulling strings, but something far more complex, and in many ways, far more tragic. A person whose emotional life was arrested at the precise moment it should have been. Nurtured, who learned to perform in vulnerability, because vulnerability, in their earliest experience, was simply too costly. Who expresses what might genuinely be love through jealousy and possessiveness, because those are the only emotional channels that remained open after everything softer was sealed shut. And nowhere is this complexity more visible, more confusing for the people who love them than in the pattern most survivors describe with an almost universal consistency. The hot and cold cycle, the push and pull, the intimacy followed by withdrawal, the warmth followed by cruelty, the connection followed by such sudden and total distance that you find yourself wondering whether the closeness was ever real at all. It was real. That is the first thing to understand. But here is what is equally true. For the narcissist, that closeness was also terrifying. Not intellectually, not in a way they could articulate or even recognize, but in the body, in the nervous system that learned decades before you arrived that intimacy is where the danger lives. Bessel van der Kolk, in his foundational work on trauma, describes how the body keeps a biological memory of threat that operates entirely independently of conscious thought. The mind may want connection. The mind may even, in its most honest moments, recognize that this person, this relationship, this particular closeness is something worth having. But the body has older instructions, and when those instructions fire, When the proximity of genuine love triggers the ancient alarm of anticipated abandonment, the response is not a decision. It is a reflex. The withdrawal is the reflex. The cruelty is sometimes the reflex. The sudden, inexplicable coldness after a weekend of warmth that felt almost like the relationship you always wanted, that is the nervous system doing what it was conditioned to do. Protect, retreat, destroy the threat before the threat destroys you. And the threat, in this devastatingly ironic architecture, is love itself. This is why the cycle is so disorienting for the people caught inside it, because you are not dealing with someone who is simply moody or ambivalent or playing games for the pleasure of control, though it can look exactly like all of those things from the outside. You are dealing with someone whose autonomic nervous system has classified emotional closeness as a survival threat, and every time the relationship deepens, every time the walls come down even slightly, that system activates. And the only way it knows to restore a sense of safety is to create distance, to push you away before you can leave, to detonate the intimacy before it can detonate them. What makes this particularly important to understand is the implication it carries about emotional investment, because a person who feels nothing does not need to run. Indifference requires no escape. You only flee from what you cannot afford to lose. You only detonate what matters enough to frighten you. The hot and cold cycle is not evidence that they don't care. It is, in its deeply broken and painful way, evidence of precisely the opposite. They run because they feel too much, not too little, and they have never, not once in their lives, and shown that staying was safe. There is a behavior that nearly every person who has been in a close relationship with a narcissist will recognize the moment it is named. It does not announce itself dramatically. It does not arrive with the intensity of jealousy or the visible chaos of the hot and cold cycle. It operates quietly, almost invisibly, in the background of the relationship, and often continues long after the relationship has formally ended. It is the behavior of monitoring, of watching, of keeping tabs in ways that are subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, but consistent enough to reveal an unmistakable preoccupation. They check your social media at odd hours. They ask mutual friends casual questions that are not actually casual. They know details about your life that you never shared with them directly. They appear, sometimes with an almost uncanny timing, precisely when you have begun to move forward. And if you were to confront them about it, if you were to name what you were observing, they would deny it with complete conviction, or reframe it as coincidence, or turn it into an accusation about your arrogance for assuming they were paying that much attention. But they were. They always were. Now, the instinctive interpretation of this behavior is control. And control is certainly part of the narcissistic repertoire. We should not be naive about that. But if we stop at control as the explanation, we miss something psychologically crucial. Because control, in the purely strategic sense, would be purposeful and directed. It would have a clear objective. What we observe in narcissistic monitoring behavior is something that often has no strategic endpoint. They watch without acting. They gather information without using it. They remain preoccupied with someone they claim not to care about, in ways that serve no practical purpose whatsoever. That is not strategy. That is attachment. Object relations theory, developed by psychoanalysts like Melanie Klein and later Donald Winnicott, gives us a framework for understanding this with precision. It proposes that we do not simply relate to people as they are. We carry internal representations of them, emotional objects that persist in the psyche independent of physical presence. For most people with healthy attachment histories, these internal representations are stable. When a relationship ends, there is grief, there is adjustment, and gradually the internal object softens and integrates into the broader landscape of lived experience. But for the narcissist, whose attachment system was formed in conditions of profound inconsistency, these internal representations become almost obsessive in their intensity. The person they cannot emotionally process becomes a figure they cannot psychologically release. And so, the monitoring continues, not because they have a plan, not because they are executing some calculated campaign of control, but because the internal object as you live in their psyche, refuses to be resolved. You remain unfinished emotional business, and the watching is, in its most naked psychological truth, a substitute for the intimacy they cannot bring themselves to pursue directly. Mattei would recognize this immediately as the behavior of someone who has severed the connection between longing and expression. The longing remains vivid, persistent, undeniable, But the pathway between that longing and any authentic reaching out has been closed off by decades of self-protective conditioning. And so the longing finds the only outlet available to it: observation from a safe distance, presence without vulnerability, connection that carries no risk because it never has to be acknowledged. They watch you because they cannot bring themselves to reach for you. And in that quiet, hidden vigil, whether they would ever admit it or not, is the clearest possible portrait of someone still emotionally tethered to a person they have convinced themselves they no longer need. We have traveled a considerable distance together in this conversation. We began with the paradox, the emotional life hidden beneath the performance of indifference. We moved through the architecture of that performance, understanding how early attachment wounds foreclose the very channels through which love might naturally flow. We identified jealousy as the crack in the mask, the hot and cold cycle as the nervous system's ancient reflex against intimacy, and the quiet surveillance behavior as longing that has lost its voice. Each of these, when examined honestly, points toward the same uncomfortable truth: that the narcissist's relationship to the people who matter to them is not characterized by absence of feeling, but by a profound and chronic inability to metabolize it. And nowhere does this truth reveal itself more starkly, more undeniably, than in the moment they come back. Because they do come back, with a consistency that survivors find equal parts confusing and devastating. The narcissist returns. After the discard, after the withdrawal, the silence, the replacement, the performance of having moved on completely and effortlessly, they return. Sometimes weeks later, sometimes months, sometimes years, sometimes at the precise moment you have finally, painstakingly, begun to rebuild something that resembles peace. And they arrive not with explanation or accountability, rarely with those, but with intensity, with charm, with the particular gravitational pull that characterized the very beginning, before everything unraveled. This behavior has a clinical name. Psychologists call it hoovering, a reference to the vacuum cleaner, to the act of sucking someone back in. And the dominant cultural narrative around it is almost entirely cynical. The narcissist returns for supply, for ego, for the satisfaction of knowing they can still reach you. And while these motivations are real, and while we should never be naive about them, to reduce the return exclusively to strategy is to make the same mistake we have been carefully dismantling throughout this entire conversation. It is to assume that because someone is incapable of healthy love, they are therefore incapable of any emotional experience that resembles it. The research on anxious and disorganized attachment styles tells us something more nuanced. Individuals with these patterns and narcissists, almost invariably present with one or both, experience what psychologists call proximity-seeking behavior under conditions of perceived loss. In plain language, they are pulled toward the people they are attached to most powerfully precisely when separation becomes real. Not when it is threatened, not when it is performed, when it actually begins to solidify, when you stop reaching out, when you begin healing visibly, when the emotional distance they created starts to feel permanent rather than controllable. That is when the pull becomes irresistible. John Bowlby described attachment behavior as a biological system activated by threat of loss. And what is remarkable, what is psychologically significant, is that this system does not discriminate based on the quality of the attachment. It does not activate only in people who express their love well, who are present and consistent and safe. It activates in anyone for whom the bond carried genuine emotional weight. And for the narcissist, who has spent the duration of the relationship performing indifference, the activation of this system, in the face of real loss, is perhaps the most honest moment they will ever have. They return because something in them, beneath all the conditioning and all the armor and all the elaborate self-deception, recognizes what is being lost. And that recognition, however distorted its expression, however damaging its arrival, is not nothing. But here is what you must hold with equal clarity. The fact that they feel the loss does not mean they have developed the capacity to honor what they almost lost. Feeling the wound and doing the work to heal it are two entirely different countries. And most narcissists, without profound intervention, will spend their entire lives standing at the border, never quite crossing over. There is a question that surfaces in almost every honest conversation about narcissistic relationships, and it tends to arrive quietly, usually long after the relationship has ended. In the specific silence of 3 a.m, when the defenses are down and the mind goes searching for something it cannot quite name, the question is this: was any of it real? Was the beginning real? Was the person who looked at you like you were the most remarkable human being they had ever encountered, was that person real? Were those early conversations that stretched into dawn, that intensity, that sense of being seen and chosen and utterly irreplaceable, was any of that something other than performance, other than calculation, other than the opening move of a game whose rules you didn't know you were playing? It is one of the most painful questions a person can sit with, and I want to answer it with the same precision and honesty we have brought to everything else in this conversation. Yes, it was real, not entirely, and not in the way you deserved, but the emotional surge that produced it was genuine. What we call love bombing, that overwhelming intensity of attention, affirmation, and apparent devotion in the early stages of a narcissistic relationship, is almost universally framed as pure manipulation, a calculated strategy deployed to establish dependency before the mask comes off. And the manipulative dimension is real. We should not dismiss it, but if we look beneath the behavior to the psychological state that generates it, something more complex and more human comes into view. The beginning of a significant relationship activates, in virtually every human nervous system, a neurochemical cascade: dopamine, oxytocin, norepinephrine. The architecture of romantic attachment floods the system and produces something that genuinely resembles euphoria. This is not unique to narcissists. What is unique is what happens to a narcissist inside that state. Because for someone whose emotional life has been sealed behind decades of self-protective armor, the early stages of connection before intimacy deepens enough to become threatening, before vulnerability is required, before the wound gets close enough to the surface to activate the defense, represent a rare and genuine opening, a window, however brief, in which something that functions like authentic feeling moves through them, relatively unobstructed. Haynes Kohut described the narcissist's experience of idealization as a real psychological event, not a performance of admiration, but a genuine merging with an idealized other that temporarily satisfies the deepest unmet needs of the self. In those early weeks and months, you were not simply useful to them. You were, in the particular language of their psychological architecture, everything they had always needed and never been permitted to receive. The intensity was real because the need behind it was real, ancient, unresolved, enormous need. What distorts it, what transforms genuine feeling into something that functions like manipulation, is not the absence of emotion, but the inevitable collision between that emotion and the wound. As closeness deepens, as the relationship moves from idealization into the ordinary and necessary vulnerability of sustained intimacy, the defense system reactivates, the armor reasserts itself, and the person who was the answer to everything becomes, in the narcissistic psyche, a threat to be managed rather than a partner to be cherished. The love bombing was the feeling before the fear arrived. And perhaps the most clarifying and most heartbreaking truth in this entire conversation is this: the narcissist at the beginning was not showing you who they pretended to be. They were showing you who they desperately wished they could remain. We have arrived, together, at the place where understanding must become action, not the frantic, reactive kind of action that pain tends to produce: the blocking, the obsessive replaying, the pendulum swing between wanting them back and wanting them to suffer, but the quiet, deliberate, deeply intentional action of someone who has chosen, perhaps for the first time in the context of this relationship, to place themselves at the center of their own story. Because that is what this entire conversation has been building toward. Not sympathy for the narcissist, though understanding, as we have seen, inevitably produces some. Not a framework for fixing them, or waiting for them, or loving them more skillfully in hopes that this time, the outcome will be different. What we have been building, carefully and brick by brick, is clarity. And clarity, in the aftermath of a narcissistic relationship, is not a small thing. It is very nearly everything. Let me be precise about what this clarity does and does not mean. It does not mean that what happened to you was acceptable. The harm was real. The confusion was real. The slow erosion of your self-trust, the way you began to doubt your own perceptions, the moments you found yourself apologizing for pain that was caused by someone else entirely, all of that was real. And none of it was your fault. Understanding the psychological origins of someone's behavior does not retroactively make that behavior less damaging. A wound does not hurt less because you understand the instrument that caused it. What the clarity does mean, what it makes possible, is the ending of a particular kind of suffering that has nothing to do with what they did, and everything to do with the story you have been telling yourself about what it meant. The story that said you were not enough, that if you had loved differently, more patiently, more wisely, the outcome would have been different. That the person who showed up in those early weeks open, intense, magnetic, present, is the real version, and everything that followed was an aberration you somehow caused or failed to prevent. That story is not true, and you have been paying an extraordinary price to keep it alive. Gabor Mate writes that the greatest damage trauma does is not in the original wound, but in the way it teaches us to abandon ourselves in response to it. And this, I would suggest, is the most important psychological truth to carry out of this conversation, not as a concept, as a lived practice.